Welcome to Zodiac Theory Channel series Under the Crosshair presentation on Frederick Coe, Part 4, Part 2 of the Nexus Between Coe and Murder. Presented by Zodiac Theory Discord researcher and admin Kim. I am your host, Cheryl. As a reminder, this is a multi-part presentation on Kim's theory and research, so if you have not seen Part 1, 2, or 3, of her Under the Hot Crosshair series or her unfiltered presentation, please see the links in the description box and watch those. And please like, subscribe, and share, and ring that little bell to be reminded of future episodes. Please put your questions for Kim in the comment box so that we can address them in future episodes. Welcome, Kim, and what do you have for us today?
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you to everyone who listens in at some point to presentation number 4 on Frederick Coe. Today I'm presenting a cold case that occurred in February of 1969 in the small city of Millwood, which is a suburb of the city of Spokane, Washington. Millwood lies to the north and east and is surrounded on 3 sides by Spokane. For a number of reasons, I am of the opinion that Frederick Coe should be at the top of the suspect list in this case. There are no good suspects that law enforcement has in this case as far as the public has been made aware. As in most of these tragic incidents, the death of a young man left behind many grieving relatives. Yet there was also good that flowed out of this tragic situation. To put this incident in context, it occurred about 2 months after the December 1968 murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and almost 5 months prior to the Zodiac resuming his killing spree in July of 1969. A quick recap here of the previous presentations on Frederick Coe. In presentation number 1, I discussed basic MO or manner of being of the Zodiac and shared anecdotes which demonstrated that Frederick Coe is like the Zodiac killer in fundamental ways. In presentation number 2, I discussed the timeline of Frederick Coe from 1965 to 1970 so that you could see what was going on in his life shortly before, during, and after the Zodiac killer's canonical crimes. The documentation that does exist concerning Fred Coe's whereabouts in February of 1969 consistently places him in Spokane at that time, which is important context for the material I will present today. In presentation number 3, I delivered the first part of the topic, the nexus between Coe and murder. The prosecutor that sent Fred Coe to prison in 1981 has told me they felt he had the capacity for murder, but couldn't connect him to any. In order to show why he may have been capable of committing an act of homicide, I delved deep into his motivations and goals, his failures and frustrations, and the influences in his life, that is, the murderous ideologies he was steeping in, to demonstrate that there is cause to believe he may have had the capacity and the motivation to commit murder residing within him in the late 1960s. I'm going to stay here at the beginning, and hopefully I will be clear. There are not a lot of specifics about the case I am going to present today that align with the known Zodiac killer crimes. That is, there will be no young couples parked in cars in quiet lovers' lanes or lounging at the lakeside. Nowhere will there be any mention of cabs or cab drivers or taunting ciphers or letters from the perpetrator published in the local newspapers. The common response here would be different MO, not the Zodiac. I hope in the prior presentations I have given you reason to put a hold on that sort of thinking and take the time to consider the evidence in this case with an open mind. While the MO may be strikingly different, it might be that there are nonetheless some interesting behaviors and details that do correlate in some manner to the Zodiac killer's behaviors in his known crimes. These sorts of details are important for reasons that Sharon Hagen explained in the video that I shared in presentation number 1, and I will quote her here. Offenders, when they commit crimes, can't help but give us clues about who they are and where they've been, what their prior relationships look like, what their future relationships are likely to look like. So these kinds of things can give us very important clues in how to search for him and how he's likely to behave when we encounter him. As we review the case today, please pay close attention to the behavior of this perpetrator and be watchful for any similarities between his behavior and that of both Frederick Coe and the Zodiac killer. On February 6, 1969, young housewife Sandra Lee Tutton was enjoying her status as the lucky winner of a local television contest. She was awarded a $75 check and appeared in a program on this local television channel to accept her prize. The video recording of this event subsequently aired several more times. On February 12th, 1969, a man phoned her apartment on East Liberty Avenue in Millwood, claiming to be part of a Vietnamese relief organization collecting money and clothing for soldiers in Vietnam. This no doubt pulled a bit at Mrs. Tutton's heartstrings, as her own young husband, Army Captain James Tutton Jr., was currently stationed in Vietnam. Mrs. Tutton intended to use her prize check to help her fund an upcoming trip to Hawaii on February 27th, where her husband would soon be on his rest and recuperation leave. Because her husband was in Vietnam, Sandra told the caller that she would donate clothing. The caller promised to come by her residence the next morning to pick up the donation. For some unstated reason, Mrs. Tutton was apprehensive about the visit, and her brother, Terry Willmschen, agreed to stay overnight, as he sometimes did, to assist her with the grocery shopping and the care of her 1-year-old daughter. At 10:07 the following morning, the foggy, overcast morning on February 13th, 1969, the caller arrived as scheduled. Upon opening her door, she was confronted by a man wearing brown, horn-rimmed sunglasses with brown-tinted lenses and his jacket hood drawn tightly around his face. He pulled a gun on Mrs. Tutton and said, "Don't worry, I won't hurt your baby. Give me your MONEY." Mrs. Tutton told him she had no money, but offered him the $75 check she received from the TV station. He refused to accept the check, so she told him that she had an expensive watch that he could have. She headed to the bedroom to retrieve it, and he followed her. Her brother, who had been getting dressed in a separate bedroom, came out armed with a golf club and took a swing at the intruder, making contact. The man went down to his knees, spun around, and fired his gun twice at Terry, who fled into the bedroom where he had been changing and where Mrs. Tutton's daughter was sleeping, shutting the door behind him. The bullets that were fired reached their target, with one traveling through Terry's lungs. He would later be pronounced dead at the scene. Mrs. Tutton grabbed for the gun, and at some point the gun went off again, hitting her in the face. She would require at least 2 surgeries to repair the damage, and one report from 1971 indicated she still carried the bullet in her body. Her daughter was unharmed in the incident and was cared for by family members, while Mrs. Tutton was admitted to Valley General Hospital for care of her injuries. Terry Willmschen was buried on February 17th, 1969, after a service at Opportunity Free Methodist Church. It is, of course, common for those bent on evil to attempt to obscure their face, but I do want to point out that in the Lake Berryessa incident, similar to the murder of Terry Willmschen, the Zodiac also opted to wear sunglasses and a hood of a different type, which hid a significant part of his face. Additionally, the perpetrator at Lake Berryessa co-opted the compliance of his victims, as did the perpetrator in this 1969 cold case, by telling them not to worry. He just wanted their money. After the scuffle, Mrs. Tutton first went to the phone to summon help, while the intruder fled from Mrs. Tutton's lower rear-facing apartment, exiting the complex out the front door of the building. Outside, he was observed by the apartment manager, Henry Wallen, and wife Flordine, as they were getting into their car in the parking area in front of the complex. Upon spotting the couple, the man slowed to a walk and shouted, "What's going on in there?" He proceeded in an easterly direction and scrambled over a snowbank, and was last seen in the parking lot of the Mill Tavern at North 3400 Argonne, just east of the apartment building. It appears there is a discrepancy in the report, or the numbering has changed since 1969. In the current era, the Old Mill Grill, located at North 3405 Argonne, is just east of the Liberty Bell apartments. There is a detail in this account that we should find interesting in the context of the Paul Stine episode, and that is this perpetrator slowed to a walk when he knew he was spotted, rather than moving like a bat out of hell, as would be expected behavior for anyone who had just killed a person and needed a fast retreat from the vicinity of the crime. Furthermore, he commented loudly to those who saw him. It is interesting that the person thought to be the individual who killed Paul Stine was also observed walking in the area near the scene of the murder by Donald Falk and Eric Zelms. The Zodiac would later taunt the police and claim he was questioned by officers, and he told them he had seen a man running down the street waving a gun. As far as we know, this was a false story, but it is a story the Zodiac put down in writing, and so it may reflect how he envisions himself behaving in the vicinity shortly after one of his crimes. That is, he might be walking in the area, and he may choose to make comments to those he encountered. The Zodiac Killer and Fred Coe, fantastical storytellers of stories of a very specific genre. Frederick Coe wrote a similar sort of story that was published in the journal Justice Denied, wherein he claims to have been searching for Spokane's South Hill rapist when he was stopped and questioned by police on what he was doing in an area where there were a high number of rapes occurring. He claims to have told the officer that he was searching for clues for the South Hill rapist and was told to mind his own business. I have no evidence this story was ever corroborated. Again, a would be perpetrator in the hot zone with a clever story to report about his interaction with a police officer. Frederick Coe, a theatrical writer like the Zodiac, would enjoy mocking the cops that he hated. Maybe he hated them because in his youth, out one night playing pranks with a couple of friends, he was confronted by the cops. He chose to run off his mouth, which earned him a ride home in the police car and a talk between his parents and the officer who brought him home. This would have invoked argument and denial in Fred, just as it always did whenever he was called to account for any of his inappropriate behaviors or even minor mistakes, such as a math error. Opportunity. As stated previously, the best information we have on Frederick Coe's whereabouts places him in Spokane in February of 1969 with a high degree of certainty. There are not multiple conflicting stories as to his whereabouts at this time, as is the case with other more critical time periods. He was most likely residing at his parents' house at this time, as he states in a 2008 deposition that when he worked in radio in Spokane, he lived with his parents on a few occasions, though he also says he mostly lived mainly on my own in apartments. Given that his entire radio work history in Spokane seems at most to include several months in 1968, several months in 1969, and a brief but undefined period in 1971, it does not seem possible that he could have lived both mainly on my own in apartments and with his parents on a few occasions. The sum of his work history simply does not add up to enough time to reasonably accomplish all of these living arrangements. As is usually the case, there appears to be some deceit here with Coe's testimony. I would put my money on him residing with his parents in 1969. Either way, the important point is that it does seem quite certain he was living in Spokane at the time of the Willmschen homicide. Beginning on February 13th, 1969, news articles on the homicide were published on a daily basis for the next week before stretching out to longer intervals between reports. It is interesting to note that critical details changed over the course of a short period of time, including details concerning the perpetrator's clothing, his age, and even the address where the crime occurred. Please note here the summary on the location of the crime. Early in the news reports, the location of the apartment was reported to be East 9110 Liberty and next reported as East 9011 Liberty. The correct location of the Tutton residence is East 9011 Liberty Avenue. The Spokane Chronicle was the first paper to pick up the news story, as it was the evening paper in Spokane. The Chronicle was also the first to report the correct location to East 9011 in a February 14th report, with the spokesman review not correcting this detail until an article published on February 18th. This is a 5-day period in which important but incorrect detail was put out to the public by the spokesman review. Of additional interest in the news reports is evolving detail concerning the intruder's apparel. In the earliest report, his jacket is described as light blue in color, a detail that changes over to bright blue and continues to be described as bright blue or simply blue for all subsequent news reports. This detail is an important one, as it could prevent someone from calling in a tip if they had a person of interest with a blue ski jacket, but the hue did not match the detail in the news reports. It does appear to have been a settled point that the ski jacket, worn by the person of interest in this crime, was indeed a bright blue one with a hood. Even so, it appears the debate over the jacket continued, with some opinion expressed that the jacket may have been more like a nylon windbreaker. It is fortunate the color detail was observed in the daylight and not at nighttime, as it can be difficult to differentiate between bright blue and dark blue at night. His other dress was consistently reported as dark trousers, white socks, and black shoes. The height of the perpetrator stated in the news reports also changed, but not drastically. Initially, he was reported as being under 6 feet tall at 5'9" or 5'10". This seems to have settled in at about 6 feet tall, beginning several days after the murder and remaining unchanged at that height. I will begin interjecting details on Frederick Coe here so we can see if he fits the witness testimony concerning the unidentified perpetrator in the Willmschen homicide. Frederick Coe's height is less certain than it really ought to be for someone who is identified, arrested, convicted, and has spent 25 years in a penitentiary and another 19 years confined in a special commitment center. In the most recent data I have concerning his height, that is the deposition taken in 2008 in preparation for his civil commitment hearing, he claims he is close to 6'2". At the time of his arrest in 1981, we do find a similar height reported. From Jack Olson's book. At the station, Roy Allen took a look at Coe's driver's license. It listed his height as 6'2". He weighed and measured the suspect carefully and noted that Coe seemed to be stretching upward. Allen scratched on his notepad, 6 1/4, 172 pounds. In records held by the Washington State Department of Corrections, he is listed in one 1985 document as 73 inches or 6'1", and in another source as both 73 inches or 6'1" and 6'2". Height is important to Coe as he views it as favorable to be taller rather than shorter, as evidenced in the following quote from Olson's novel describing an incident not long before his 1981 arrest when Coe was 34 years of age. "It's not luck," Coe insisted, sipping a Perrier and taking on a troubled look. "Women fall all over you smaller guys. I don't understand it." He began talking about his friend Jay Williams, a man of Hatcher's approximate height. "It frustrated the hell out of me the way Jay could get at women in high school. He had 'em waiting in line. I just couldn't seem to get their attention." He sighed. "Still can't." Unquote. Pictured here is a news article that appeared in the Las Vegas Review. In 1973, when Coe was a radio DJ at Keno in Las Vegas, his broadcasting team took on the Las Vegas Stars, a minor league team in the International Basketball League. Frederick Coe, aka Mark Mitchell, is listed at 6'1". I shared this article with a friend of his, and he responded with the following. Typical of Fred, he only wishes he was 6'1". He was 5'11", which seemed tall to me, though. He and I did play church league basketball when we were in late grade school, but neither of us were especially good at the sport. So I don't imagine he added a lot to their lineup. Unquote. My best guess on Coe's height is that it is about 6 feet, maybe a little under or over. I'm not going to go into detail on weight, as the earliest information I have is from his arrest, where his weight was recorded at 172 pounds in 1981. The perpetrator in the 1969 Willmschen homicide was described as anywhere between 155 and 170 pounds, with later reports settling in at about 160 pounds. As this homicide occurred 12 years before Coe's arrest, and Coe was visibly heavier in 1981 than in photos from the early 1970s, he was likely within the 155 to 170 pounds weight range described by those who saw this perpetrator. One unwavering detail in the description of this perpetrator is that he had thin lips. Even one of the earliest headlines indicated that a thin-lipped man was being sought for this murder. Does this detail fit Frederick Coe? From a June 17, 1979 massage parlor assault that was later attributed to Coe. She stated the subject had very thin lips. From a February 25, 1981 assault of a victim who later identified Coe as her assailant. She was hypnotized and she added minor detail to his physical description. She said his hair was blonde and curly and about 2 to 3 inches long, that eyebrows were medium, and that his eyes were gray or hazel or something like that. Additionally, she observed under hypnosis that he had hollow cheeks, a dimple on his chin, a few pockmarks on the chin, and thin lips. Many of Coe's victims did not get a good look at him, as he took precautions to prevent his victims from looking at his face. In these two cases, though, both of these victims were able to identify him as their perpetrator, and both of them did indeed get a good look at him. The perpetrator in the Willmschen homicide is described in one article as having eyes that had dark bags under them and tended to droop at the sides. The dark bags could have been temporary or could have been indicative of allergies such as Frederick Coe suffered from by 1963 when he was diagnosed with allergies to over 100 substances at the age of 16. He would later be absolved from work detail at both the prison and the Special Commitment Center where he currently resided until September of 2025, just last month. And this exclusion from detail was due in part to his allergy diagnosis. Even in his realty career, his colleagues reported that he asked them to lick his stamps and envelopes, claiming the contaminants activated his allergies. This, of course, is of interest because of the issue concerning the Zodiac and the debate over whether or not he licked his own stamps and envelopes. Concerning the droopiness of Terry Willmshen's murderer's eyes, it is interesting to note that Coe was described in the following manner by his live-in girlfriend. Kevin had said his mother was 59, and a certain softness confirmed the age, but underneath a chalky patina of geisha makeup, she had perfect features, full lips, and dark eyes of the deepest blue, slightly slanted like Kevin's. One victim who he spent a considerable amount of time assaulting described him in this manner. Maybe 5'9", 5'10", stocky, dark hair, kind of slanty eyes, and another victim's description of his eyes, gray-blue color and slightly slanted shape. Still elsewhere, his eyes were described as deep-set and almond-shaped. During his lineup, a victim said something to the effect of, she tried to get a good look at his eyes, but couldn't because he was squinting. As to the complexion of the perpetrator of the Willmschen homicide, it seems consistently described as light and even pale. And Frederick Coe's complexion from Olson's book, his coloring had gone from its usual pale to downright chalky. Still elsewhere, I'm told a friend had commented that Coe looked like a pale Jesus. This likely occurred during his late 1960s, early 1970s counterculture days, which brackets 1969, when he wore his hair long and dressed the part at times. Coe regularly avoided sun exposure due to its effect on aging. He was vain, and of course, one of his lifelong goals was to become as handsome as he could possibly become. Not a goal compatible in any manner with the premature aging effects of too much sunlight. This explains in part why he was often described as pale by those who were close to him, and as having a light complexion by one of his light rape victims who saw him in the early morning daylight. As to the wrinkles reported in a couple of the articles here, it is hard to weigh the effect of a hood drawn tightly around the perpetrator's face with the perception that this perpetrator had wrinkles on his face. Estimates from the eyewitnesses produced an age range of 23 to 50 years old, which is unfortunately wide. It seems there was quite a bit of controversy associated with the observed age of the offender, starting at the onset of the investigation, with one witness stating that he could have been even younger than 23. Those that observed him as he was distancing himself from the scene of the crime described the manner in which he walked as agile. After some intensive questioning, the age range seems to have increased up to the age of 50, before falling back and coalescing at around 35 to 45. Perhaps this was a compromise of sorts. It is cause to wonder all of these evolving changes in the description of the perpetrator. Intensive questioning of the witnesses was reported, and it seems to have been aimed at reconciling the discrepancies. Early on, though, when witness testimonies were at their freshest, the sheriff seemed to have been lacking in conviction with regard to a firm description of the perpetrator. From the Spokane Chronicle, February 15th, 1969. Sheriff William J. Riley, quote, he said the killer has been described as about 25, although some felt he could be younger and some felt he could have been somewhat older. He said his department has received information that the assailant walked with a slight limp, had thin lips, and may have had a speech impediment. The slayer reportedly was wearing a hooded blue ski parka. Riley, however, advised residents not to be deterred if they know of a suspect who doesn't match this description. Sheriff Riley went on to say that law enforcement officers have found many times that first descriptions are often wrong, unquote. Perhaps there are some lessons here in how we ought to think about the estimates in the age of the Zodiac killer. There were some characteristics reported as maybes. These include that he may have had a speech impediment, may not be very intelligent, and he may be dull acting. In one source, it was also stated that he walked with a slight limp, but given the blow he received from the golf club, it seems possible this might have been a temporary condition. He was otherwise seen to be very agile. The evidence in the Wilmshed homicide supports that this was a planned out event. Contacting Mrs. Tutton the day before he arrived on her doorstep, concocting a story that would give him permission to appear there, and arriving garbed in a hood and sunglasses and armed with a weapon all suggest that he planned ill intent and he was prepared to carry out his crime. Police reports waffled somewhat as to motive, initially classifying it as robbery and homicide, but quickly changing over to that of criminal assault, changing to robbery when the perpetrator realized he was not alone. Reports acknowledge that other apartments in the complex were more accessible to him, but his choice of the Tutton apartment and his phoning ahead support the presumption that he was targeting the Tutton residence. His initial refusal of the check offered him further detracts from the theory that he was simply there to engage in robbery. This seems a risky undertaking to phone ahead and to appear in broad daylight in the middle of the morning when you would expect all of the residents to be awake. Why not pillage a place in the nighttime, or better yet, when no one is home if your intent is merely robbery? If the TV video of Mrs. Tutton accepting her prize is what drew you to this residence, why not take the check then, if indeed the motive is robbery? It seems much more likely that the motive was the criminal assault of Mrs. Tutton. While probably not rare, this mode of operation seems like one only a subgroup of would-be criminal assaulters would use to gain access to a woman. A ruse, the concocting of a story to justify appearing on Mrs. Tutton's doorstep is interesting, but does it connect in any way to Fred Coe? In the early 1970s, when he needed funds to get his lewd book, Sex in the White House, published, he recruited his friend on a fundraising venture. They ended up in Portland, where he contrived the idea of appearing on a woman's doorstep with the goal of seducing her to manipulate her into funding the publishing of his book. Another time, when he was down in California, he offered to look up a former partner of his friend's to say hi for him. His friend thought that was nice until another mutual friend informed him that Coe's only real goal was to seduce her, and showing up to say hello was just an excuse he drummed up to appear on her doorstep. In 1971, Fred Coe hot-prowled his way into a woman's apartment, who he did not know, and woke her up with the romantic line, "Don't you remember? You invited me here to have sex." There are more stories of Coe appearing at women's residences for various purposes, but there is an even more interesting behavioral connection to the Willmschen homicide in Frederick Coe's history, involving the exploitation of a contrived charity. It seems even in his youth he knew how to get housewives to open their doors to him. Here's an excerpt from Jack Olson's book describing some of Fred Coe's activities in his childhood. This topmost South Hill neighborhood was a temple of conspicuous consumption. Jay's family lived in one of the biggest houses. A famous cardiologist lived nearby and changed his red Mercedes every 2 years. A brain surgeon, a Jew, was forced by restrictive covenants to live in a modest house a few blocks away and was said to be richer than all the others put together. It didn't take long for Freddie to convince Jay that power and wealth were what mattered. While their classmates were playing basketball, the two boys blended their last names in a business called Wilco Enterprises, parent corporation of Wilco Purity League, Wilco Boys Club, and other Wilco subsidiaries spun from Freddie's brain. The two boys trudged from house to house seeking handouts or selling car washes and greeting cards, explaining to the housewives who smiled on their beatific faces that every cent went to charity. Unquote. The following is from an interview transcript concerning the Wilco Purity League. Question. When I go to the book, they speak of Wilco, a blending of your two names in what was an entrepreneurial partnership at the time, but at a very young age. What was Wilco and what answer? Yeah. Yeah, well, again, we didn't know, or as he said, we didn't know what vehicle we would choose for our ultimate success. But he chose the name. We combined our names. It was Wilco, and so we often raised money as little kids will. We sold a lot of things door to door, but we did it we said we were collecting money for the Wilco Boys Club or Wilco Enterprise. After a while, it became the Wilco Purity League. I don't think I even knew what that was. We were presumably uplifting the standards or morals of other young boys, I guess. But it was always going to be Wilco, whatever it finally became. And then for some reason it became Pasado. He came to me and told me it was going to be Pasado. That was going to be the new name of whatever enterprise we finally succeeded in. I think that was it by the time we were in high school. Question. Where's Pasado come from? Answer. I don't know. Question. Just a name he picked up somewhere, huh? What can you tell me about Fred's sense of self-control and discipline? Answer. Very disciplined, very much in control. I don't believe throughout of all of grade school, I don't recall that he ever missed a day of school. I don't recall him ever being late. That's one thing I really appreciated was this great discipline that he had. There is another interesting thing that happened in Spokane in late 1961 when Fred would have been 14 years and 18 months, 14 years and 8 months of age, an age that many sex offenders get their start. This incident happened at 6:45 p.m., a time of day that is more indicative of a younger offender, one who would not be missed at that time, like they may be if it were 10 p.m. This incident occurred in Brown's Addition, a neighborhood where Coe would be known to be offending 10 years later in 1971. A young woman who was living on her own was confronted by an offender inside the door of her apartment. She opened the door because she thought it was the newspaper boy. Instead, it turned out to be a youth who was wielding a 22 caliber revolver. As in the Tutton homicide and the Lake Berry incident, he proceeded to tell this young woman that he wouldn't hurt her if she did what he said. After talking with her for some time, continually attempting to reassure her, he proceeded to assault her, then took $34 from her purse and ran out the door. He was in the apartment for a little over a half an hour. He had tied up this woman, but did loosen the bindings before leaving. The police arrived not long afterwards, and while they were there, the perpetrator called the woman on the telephone to tell her not to call the police, or she would be harmed. The police were able to listen to the conversation. I wonder if this gave this perpetrator a thrill, which then became entwined with sexual fantasies, similar to how developmental experiences are known to influence the signature behaviors of heinous sexual offenders. The map pictured here is the 2.3-mile route between the Coe residence on 29th Avenue and the Browns Addition neighborhood. Not an unreasonable distance for an offender without a driver's license, and if it was Freddie Coe that was involved in this incident, better not to offend too close to the neighborhood where you've been living for the past 11 years. If you have a hard time imagining a 14-year-old engaging in such an offense, I would encourage you to read the report Juveniles Who Commit Sex Offenses Against Minors, which was published in a Juvenile Justice Bulletin by the U.S. Department of Justice, December 2009. The link is pictured here on the slide. Anyone in the know about the notorious South Hill rapes perpetrated by Coe should be objecting right now. They should be pointing out that there was no gun involved in any of the South Hill rapist incidents. The South Hill rapist threatened his victims by telling them he had a knife, though it seems most of the victims, if not all, never saw one. Guns were commonplace in households in the 1940s and 1950s. Many heads of households had been in some form of service, and like Frederick Coe's father, served in World War II. They brought home some of the spoils of war, guns and rifles among them. One of Coe's friends tells me that whether or not there were guns in the Coe household is a detail he would not have remembered because of just how common it was for guns to be present in people's homes. His own father brought home a serious assault rifle from the war, and it was present in his own home growing up. Another friend of Fred Coe told me an interesting story from the late 1960s, early 70s. He cannot exactly recall, but it seems it was sometime not far removed in time from the Willmschen homicide. He was visiting at the Coe house on 29th Avenue sometime after Fred's grandfather had died in September of 1968, and Fred showed him a gun up in his attic bedroom, the bedroom Fred had shared with his grandfather until his grandfather's death. This friend believes the gun had belonged to Fred's grandfather. He opened the gun, cleaned it, and reloaded it. And that is the extent I have on a connection between Frederick Coe and firearms. In my own opinion, it is an adequate one in the context of our discussion today. The phone call by the offender to the victim's residence shortly after he departed connects to a known Coe incident in 1979. On June 17, 1979, two massage employees at the Tiger's Den in Spokane were raped by an individual one would later identify as Coe. Similar to the offender in the 1961 incident, the Willmschen Tutton incident, And the Zodiac's Lake Berryessa incident, he co opted compliance of his victims by saying to one of them, "As long as you do what I won't hurt you." And to the other, "Don't scream and I won't hurt you. All I want to do is rob you." One of the victims offered to show him where the money was, but as in the Tutton incident, he declined, admitting, "Money's not what I want." At the conclusion of the assaults on these victims, he spent time wiping down the environment, the doorknobs, counter, the floor where he'd raped one of them, and the massage table, reminiscent of the Zodiac wiping down the cab after killing Paul Stine. He also took money from both of their purses and one of their driver's licenses before departing. Not long after leaving the massage parlor, Coe phoned the establishment, and one of the victims, hands still taped behind her back, nosed the receiver off the hook, expecting to find someone on the line who might be able to help them. She was answered with a masculine laugh coming through the phone line. Known perpetrator Coe, calling back to the crime scene, much like the 1961 perpetrator dialing his victim's residence shortly after departure, and not all that dissimilar to the Zodiac and his making a couple phone calls in the wake of his murders. On September 10th, 1979, a popular DJ who worked for KJRB in Spokane was raped by Fred Coe upon leaving the station at 11 p.m. She was ambushed before she made it to her car. Upon returning to work, something of interest in the context of our discussion happened. From Jack Olson's book. A few weeks after her rape in September, a man had called KJRB when she was on the air and told her, "I'll bet you thought I forgot about you, didn't you, sunshine?" He started laughing, and she recognized the resonant tones of the rapist. He went on, "Hey, I read in the paper that a Southside female disc jockey was raped. You told me you wouldn't call anybody. I'm coming back for you when you least expect me. It may be a week, it may be a year, it may take 10 years. This time, you're not going to make it out alive." She ran from the control room, then returned to finish her show. Frederick Coe, not the Zodiac, different MO. Can one be so certain about that? What exactly is Frederick Coe's MO? It seems there are more facets to it than appear at first glance, once one takes the time to give him a closer look. Even if you still cannot embrace the connections here between Coe and the Zodiac, is it possible you might consider the impact on an investigation of placing a very versatile offender in a compact box in your mind, denying his capacity for employing different modes of operation in his criminal activity? If you are getting to know Frederick Coe here at all, by now you should see that it's silly to place Frederick Coe in a box. It is actually egregious in the effects that sort of thinking has on any hope of shedding light on his still hidden criminal activities in 1968 through the early part of 1978, because I am certain of this. This guy did not come out of the gate at age 31 in 1978 and launch his highly successful high-density South Hill rape spree as an inexperienced offender. In the midst of all this hard to keep track of swirling detail, let's not forget what Sharon Hagan said. These offenders, when they commit their crimes, can't help but give us clues about who they are, where they've been. So those kinds of things can give us very important clues in how to search for him and how he's likely to behave when we encounter him. I am going to step away from the main topic here briefly to add some additional detail on Frederick Coe's behavior, the sort of behavior we may expect to find if we encounter him elsewhere in time and space. This particular detail is very important to know in the context of any consideration of Frederick Coe as a possible Zodiac person of interest. Late in Fred Coe's South Hill rape spree, when he was feeling the heat of the investigation into the South Hill rapist, he sent a correspondence to the Spokesman Review, which was the morning paper in Spokane. The letter was received on Saturday, February 14th, 1981, about a month before the apprehension of the South Hill rapist. 2 days earlier, the Spokesman Review had received a phone call from someone stating that it was an emergency and they needed to talk to an editor. They put city editor Robert Rose on the line. The caller asked Mr. Rose, "Did you get my letter?" Mr. Rose did not know what the caller was referring to. The caller then informed Mr. Rose that he was the South Hills rapist and they would be getting a letter explaining why I'm doing this. The caller then hung up immediately. The letter was described in a February 27th, 1981 article authored by Robert Rose as an obscure message. The message was in poetic form. Here is the poem: "The doomed plus the blessed. Mother Washington places pitchforks between her boy baby's legs, and her females she places harps. Then she labels them devils plus angels and treats them the same throughout their lives. Sincerely, which is misspelled, of course, the South Hills rapist. Fred Coe seems to have taken some effort to disguise himself in this poem. He refers to the rapist as the South Hills rapist, which indeed everyone in Spokane, Fred Coe included, knew this location wasn't the South Hills. It was the South Hill, the area where Fred Coe lived when he was growing up. When the poem was published in the newspaper, the word Washington was blotted out in hopes the author of the poem would call the newspaper again and identify himself as the author by providing the missing word. The author did make a phone call afterwards in which he supplied the missing word, but the call was not to the Spokesman Review. Instead, he called a randomly selected individual. In this call, he issued 3 death threats, one of which was to the police chief and one to the Spokesman Review city editor Robert L. Rose. He said, "We're all going out together." And he relayed specific instructions to the man who received the phone call to get a message to the city editor that he was billing the caskets to him. Urgent communications to the city editor, contempt for the police. These behaviors are very reminiscent of the Zodiac killer. For Frederick Coe, whose own father was the city editor of the Spokane Chronicle at this time, it seems to me a bit like trying to get daddy's attention for your misdeeds. And as to the reason for why he was doing this that was conveyed in the letter, it seems Mother Washington needed some management. We will take up the matter of Mother Washington and White in presentation number 5. So often, the underlying source of irritation in the lives of repeat violent offenders is the mother, at least according to one clinical psychologist, criminal expert Rachel Tolles, whose talk I attended when she came through my town. The trouble with psychopathic offenders is believed to begin in early childhood, and it is believed the problems are not merely genetic, but a complex interplay of genetic and environmental factors. No doubt, Frederick Coe's troubles began very shortly after he was born and brought home from the hospital to his parents' residence on Maple Street in Spokane, Washington, where they resided until Fred was approaching the age of 4. Back to the case at hand. When you consider means, motivation, and opportunity, it seems that Frederick Coe was in possession of all 3 and could have been the perpetrator in the Willmschen homicide. He's certainly a good fit in many respects with the physical description of the assailant. Pictured here are photos of Fred Coe, albeit much later in time than the Willmschen homicide. We can see the thinness of his lips and his light complexion. I cannot rule him out as the man in this composite, made from eyewitness impressions of the murderer of Terry Willmschen. And for all of the reasons mentioned, I think he makes for a very compelling person of interest in this incident, as well as the 1961 criminal assault. There are also the interesting behaviors here that connect to the Zodiac killer. Let's explore that a little further. The best forms of evidence remaining from the Zodiac's crimes is, of course, the phone calls he made to the police departments and the letters he later began sending to various newspapers. We know that these are most likely from the Zodiac, unlike the scraps of DNA that have been sequenced that were or were not deposited by the Zodiac. Certainly, this is an interesting feature we might want to find in any cold cases we are comparing to the Zodiac canon. It is only mentioned in one news report, but as the investigation was going into the 3rd week and Sandra Tutton was still recovering at Valley General Hospital but in good condition, the following statement from Detective Lieutenant Earl E. Brown was reported in the Spokane Chronicle. Detective Lieutenant Earl E. Brown said that in addition to many calls from citizens which have helped shed some light on the investigation, detectives have also received several crank calls and letters. He said such letters and calls figure in almost all lengthy homicide investigations. Well, I don't have any statistics on how frequently crank calls and letters are received by law enforcement departments while they are conducting investigations on homicides, nor do I know the relationship between the length of an investigation and the increase in likelihood they will be received. What I do know is that similar activity occurred in San Francisco in the Zodiac killer case, and that these calls and letters were not classified as pranks. The Zodiac killer must have understood that this was a likely outcome, and so he took care to provide details so that his calls and letters would not be attributed to a prankster. In his very first letter, he said, "To prove I killed them, I shall state some facts that only I, plus the police, know." I wonder, did he commit any crimes before this incident? And did he follow up with a call or letter which is ignored as a prank, such as the calls and letters in the Willmschen incident? Certainly, someone seeking attention and fame for his escapades would not have been happy with this response, and he would be likely to learn from it and make adaptations to prevent this from happening in the future. Perhaps calls and letters after incidents such as these are quite common, but they are something that should not be regarded in too cavalier a manner, as it may be that they are genuine attempts at communication by the perpetrator. I really wonder what was said and written in these calls and letters received by the Spokane Sheriff's Department after the murder of Terry Willmschen. Perhaps there was something in one of these to the effect of, "I'm the one that did it." One final observation on this case is that the news on this assailant was not buried on the back page. This murder made front page headlines for days following the incident on February 13th, 14th, 15th, and 18th in the Spokane Chronicle, and the murderer was referred to as Valley Slayer in one headline. If this perpetrator happened to relish attention, he was awarded with plenty of it. There's been much speculation in amateur crime circles concerning the silence of the Zodiac killer between his first attack in December of 1968 and the resumption of his killing spree in July of 1969. In the last presentation, I stated that I think it is possible that the Zodiac killer may have left the area during that interval, returning in time to commit the July 1969 murder of Darlene Farron and severe wounding of Mike Majot. I'm not the only one theorizing on this as a potential explanation for the silence between these homicides. The Wilmschen homicide fits neatly in between at a time when there's a strong reason to believe that Frederick Coe was in Spokane, in between his radio school attendance in California and the black hole in his timeline that he refuses to address beginning sometime around June of 1969 and continuing through the end of the year. To date, the mystery of the murder of Terry Lee Willmschen remains unsolved. His sister Sandra is still alive, as far as I am aware, though his mother has long passed on. In 1993, this case, among other unsolved murders in the Spokane Valley, was revisited in the Spokesman Review November 13th edition. Terry's mother, Wilma Dickinson, said she experienced shock, but not anger over the killing of her son. She is quoted in the article as follows: "There is a saying that God only gives you that which you can handle. Some people might think it's strange, but sometimes I feel like I was blessed that he felt I could handle such a traumatic situation. Terry has gained heaven. What joy," she said. "He's not the one in trouble." Also, in this 1993 article are these comments from Terry's brother, Spokane police officer Will Wilmschen, who was a senior in high school when Terry was killed. He said the family coped with their loss through their faith in Jesus Christ. "There's no resentment or bitterness," he said. "Our faith pulled us above that. If his brother's killer is still alive, Will Wilmschen hopes the man also has turned to God." He said his mother taught the family to learn a positive lesson from all events. The unexpected death of his brother many years ago taught Wilmschen how to relate to victims of crimes on the job. "Maybe I personalize their hurt because I've been there," he said. In May of this year, I decided to submit an FOI request on the Wilmschen case. The reason I had not done so earlier was that in January 2020, I had emailed a write-up over my concerns on Frederick Coe as related to this cold case to the Spokane Sheriff's Department. Though it was well received, the case was open and they could not provide me with any updates on the investigation. The last time I corresponded with them, they said they were not actively investigating Coe. Given there does not appear to be any usable evidence from which DNA can be extracted, there are not likely any viable angles by which to close this case. If Frederick Coe was the perpetrator, I know with a high degree of certainty that he's highly unlikely to ever confess. In the meantime, we are left with what we have in these cases. If my FOI request is filled and I do receive the information I'm seeking, I'll certainly share it in future presentations, and I hope to hear your questions and comments on this case. Thank you for listening to presentation number 4, Harlan Coe.
Thank you, Kim, for that interesting presentation. And thank you all for watching. If you have any questions for Kim, please put them in the comment section so we can address them in a future episode. And please like, subscribe, and share, and hit that little bell to be alerted when the next episode comes out, as well as one of our many other programs. Until we meet again, stay safe.